The dust had not settled on the Norris land in 3 years, and neither had the grief. Cyrus Norris stood at the edge of what used to be a wheat field, his boots cracked along the seams, his hat pulled low against a sun that showed no mercy and gave no apologies. The earth beneath his feet was pale and brittle, cracked into mosaic tiles the way a man's heart cracks when it has gone too long without anything soft to sustain it. 3 years of drought. 3 years of watching the sky lie to him every morning with those fat clouds that promised rain and delivered only shadow. 3 years since he had buried his father in that same hard ground, and 2 years since the last of his cattle had been sold off to keep the bank from taking the property his grandfather had broken his back to claim. He was 31 years old and he looked 45. His neighbor, old Pete Calloway, had told him just last week that he ought to smile more, that the land would feel his misery and hold on to it. Cyrus had not replied to that because Pete Calloway had not lost a father, had not watched a harvest fail for consecutive seasons, had not stood over a brother's fresh grave just last autumn when the fever took Daniel before the first cold night of October. Cyrus Norris had no smiles left. He had checked for them the way a man checks his pockets before a long journey, turning everything out, searching the lining. Nothing. The town of Caldwell, Kansas, sat about 2 miles east of the Norris property, and in the autumn of 1882 it was a town doing what all frontier towns did, surviving by the skin of its teeth and the stubbornness of its people. The cattle drive still moved through, though less frequently now. The saloon on Merchant Street did its steady business. The general store run by a man named Elias Firth kept the community supplied with flour, salt, coffee, and the kind of quiet gossip that flavors a small town's daily life more than anything else. It was into this town, on a Wednesday morning in late September, that a stagecoach arrived carrying, among other passengers, a woman named Sarah Crawford. She stepped down from that coach with a carpetbag in one hand and a look in her eyes that was neither timid nor reckless, but something precise and determined that sat right between the two. She was 26 years old, dark-haired, with a face that had seen weather and not softened on account of it. She wore a blue cotton dress that had been washed so many times it had turned the color of a pale winter sky, and her boots were sturdy, sensible things that told you she had not come to this part of Kansas for decorative purposes. She had come because her aunt, Martha Greer, had written to her from Caldwell with an offer of a room and steady work in the kitchen of the boarding house Martha operated on the south side of town. Sarah had been living in St. Louis for 2 years prior, working in a laundry that paid little and demanded much. And when the letter arrived, she had read it 3 times before folding it carefully and deciding that west was better than standing still. Martha Greer was a stout woman with red cheeks and opinions about everything, and she met Sarah at the edge of town with a firm hug and an immediate flood of information. "You will share a room with no one. You will have Sundays for yourself after the noon meal is served, and I pay honest wages," Martha said, pulling Sarah along the main street at a pace that suggested time was always short. "The men who board here are decent on the whole. One of them talks in his sleep, but he is otherwise harmless." "You cook well." "I cook very well," Sarah said simply. "Good. The last girl I had could boil water acceptably, and that was the full extent of her talents." Sarah took in the town as they walked. Caldwell was rougher than St. Louis, but cleaner than she had feared. The street was unpaved and the wind carried a permanent suggestion of horse and dry grass, but the buildings were solid, and the people she passed looked at her with the frank curiosity of a small community rather than the blank indifference of a city. She noticed the livery stable, the sheriff's office, a church with white paint peeling at the edges, the general store. She noticed a man leaning against the post outside the general store who did not look up when she passed, which in itself was noticeable enough to make her look at him. He was tall, lean in the way of a man who had not been eating enough, with forearms brown as saddle leather and hands that rested at his sides with a stillness that seemed deliberate. His jaw was set hard. He was staring at the ground as though it owed him something. The shadow of his hat brim cut across his face like a wound. Sarah looked away and kept walking. She did not think of him again for the rest of that day, because Martha's boarding house revealed itself to be a place that required immediate and sustained attention. There were 4 boarders at present. There was a kitchen that had been used without great care, a pantry that needed organizing, a stove that ran hot on the left side, and a back garden with a small vegetable plot that had somehow survived the drought better than the farms outside of town, because Martha watered it with obsessive dedication every single morning before sunrise. Sarah rolled up her sleeves and went to work. By the end of that first week, the boarding house kitchen smelled different. It smelled like something worth coming home to. Martha noticed and said nothing, which was the highest form of compliment the older woman offered. The boarders noticed too. A traveling merchandise man named Garrett Webb told Sarah at dinner on Friday that the biscuits were the finest he had encountered between the Missouri River and the Colorado Territory. Sarah thanked him and asked if anyone wanted more coffee. She heard about Cyrus Norris for the first time on a Saturday morning, when she was at Firth's General Store collecting an order Martha had placed. Elias Firth was a talkative man who used the act of gathering items off shelves as an opportunity for extended commentary on everything and everyone. He told Sarah about the drought while wrapping a pound of coffee beans. He told her about the farms that had failed, the families that had packed up and moved to Colorado or California or anywhere that wasn't here. He told her about the Norris place, how it had been in the family since 1861, how Hector Norris had built it with timber he hauled himself, how Hector had died 3 years back right at the beginning of the drought, as if the land had taken him as a down payment on what was coming. His son Cyrus is hanging on by pure stubbornness, Firth said, setting a sack of flour on the counter. Comes in once a week for supplies, doesn't talk much, doesn't laugh at all. He paused, seeming to feel the weight of that statement. I have not heard that man laughing going on 3 years. Used to be a man who laughed easy. His brother Daniel used to say you could hear Cyrus laughing from clear across a field. Not anymore. Sarah accepted the wrapped parcels and carried them back to the boarding house without much comment, but the description of the man lodged itself in her mind the way descriptions sometimes do when they carry an image so precise it becomes difficult to shake. She thought of the man outside the general store. The still hands, the downward gaze. She thought no more of it after that or told herself she didn't. Caldwell in the autumn had a particular quality of light, amber and slanted, that made even the dry and struggling things look briefly golden. Sarah found that she liked the town more than she had expected. She liked the directness of the people. She liked that when Martha introduced her around, the women at the church social on the second Sunday looked at her with curiosity, but without the cold assessment she had encountered in the laundry district of St. Louis, where women sized each other up the way merchants inspect competing goods. Here the curiosity was warmer. Here people actually wanted to know her answer when they asked where she was from. She told them she had grown up in central Missouri, on a farm, which explained the cooking and the ease with which she moved around an agricultural community. Her father had been a wheat farmer. She knew droughts. She knew the particular kind of desperation that settled into a farming family when the rains failed to come, how it changed the way people spoke to each other, softened some voices and hardened others, turned some men into philosophers and others into something bleak and distant that their families barely recognized. The Sunday social was held on the church lawn, which the ladies of the congregation had decorated with late-season sunflowers still managing to hold their heads up. Sarah was standing with a cup of lemonade talking to a woman named Ruth Hennessy, who ran the seamstress shop, when she saw him again. Cyrus Norris came to the edge of the church lawn and stopped. He was dressed better than the week before, meaning his shirt was clean and his hat was his good one. But he wore the same expression he had worn outside the general store, flat, careful, a man moving through public space on obligation rather than desire. He was there, she gathered from Ruth's murmured explanation, because Pastor Whitmore had made it broadly known that attendance at the monthly social was expected of all community members in good standing, and Cyrus Norris, whatever his current state of spirit, was a man who honored his obligations. He stood at the edge of things and spoke when spoken to and did not stay long. Sarah watched him from across the lawn without staring, the way you watch whether coming in, not with fear, just with attention. Ruth Hennessy saw her watching and said quietly, "He was different before. The drought took something from him that hasn't come back." "The drought takes things like that," Sarah said, and she meant it with full understanding, because she had watched it happen to her own father once, years ago. A lesser drought on a smaller farm in Missouri, and she had watched the light go out of him for 2 whole seasons before the rains came back and restored something she hadn't realized she'd missed until it returned. She finished her lemonade and helped the women clear the tables when the social ended, and she did not introduce herself to Cyrus Norris that day. There was no reason to. Their paths had not crossed, and there was nothing yet to cross them. But October came in with a cold wind that stripped the last color from the hillsides east of town, and in its wake came a series of events that drew people together the way frontier life always did, by sheer necessity and the unavoidable arithmetic of community. The first event was that Martha Greer's kitchen stove broke properly on a Wednesday afternoon, the firebox cracking along the iron seam in a way that made the stove unusable and sent a concerning amount of smoke into the kitchen. Martha stood back and surveyed the damage with her arms folded, and said a word that Sarah had not previously associated with her. The second event was that the only man in Caldwell who could repair a cast iron stove on short notice was also the only blacksmith who had the necessary materials, and he had gone to Wichita for a week to collect a large equipment order and would not return until the following Monday. The boarding house had 4 men expecting meals. Martha, who was not a woman who asked favors easily, nonetheless went around town to borrow time at the kitchens of people she knew well enough to impose on without apology. She arranged use of the church kitchen for Thursday and Friday. She arranged use of Ruth Hennessy's stove on Saturday morning. On Sunday, having exhausted her immediate social capital, she mentioned to Sarah over breakfast eaten cold, which Martha bore with visible displeasure, that she had one remaining possibility. There was a farm 2 miles east of town where the stove, she had heard, was in working order, and where she might negotiate a temporary use arrangement if the owner could be approached correctly. "Cyrus Norris," Martha said. "He's a private man and he doesn't invite people easily. But he's not unkind, and he owes me a good turn from when I helped with his brother's burial last year." She folded her hands on the table in a gesture that concluded the subject. "I'll write him a note and ask if you can use his kitchen Monday morning for the week until our stove is repaired." Sarah said that was fine. The note was sent via Pete Calloway, who was going that direction anyway. The reply came back the same afternoon, folded twice, written in a plain hand that slanted slightly to the right as if fighting a wind. The note said, "Monday morning is acceptable. The door will be unlocked." Sarah read it twice, decided she liked the economy of it, and spent Sunday evening preparing a list of everything she would need to bring with her to make the boarding house meals for the coming days. On Monday she rose before dawn, loaded her borrowed cart with the pantry items she required, and drove out along the road east of town as the sky turned from black to gray to a thin cold blue. The fields she passed were exactly as Firth had described, pale and broken, the soil gone to dust in the wide stretches, the fences standing but the livestock absent. It was a landscape that had been wrung out, and it made Sarah's chest feel tight in a way she recognized from her Missouri childhood. The Norris farmhouse was a 2-story structure in better repair than she had expected. The exterior wood was weathered but solid. The porch ran the full width of the front face. A woodpile against the south side of the house was substantial and neatly stacked, which told her something about the man, that even in difficulty he maintained order, held to the disciplines of maintenance even when everything else was falling away. There was smoke already rising from the chimney when she arrived, which meant he was up. She knocked anyway, because the note had said the door would be unlocked, but she was not going to walk into a man's house without announcing herself. The door opened. Cyrus Norris looked at her with the direct, assessing gaze of a man who had very few surprises left in him, and was not sure he wanted any more. He was taller than she had registered at the social, with dark eyes set deep under a heavy brow, a jaw rough with several days of stubble, and hands that wrapped around the door edge with a grip that suggested he had been working since before she'd arrived. "Sarah Crawford," she said, because it seemed better to start with something established. "From Martha Greer's boarding house. She wrote to you about the stove." "I know who you are," he said, not rudely, just plainly. He stepped back from the door and gestured for her to come in. The inside of the house was dim and clean in the specific way of a man who lived alone, nothing extra anywhere, nothing decorative, nothing that spoke of comfort chosen rather than comfort endured. The kitchen was to the left of the entry hall, a decent-sized room with a window that looked east toward the damaged fields. The stove was indeed in working order, a good heavy range that had been built to outlast the century, black iron and steady. A coffee pot sat on the back of it already. "I'll stay out of your way," Cyrus said. He was already moving back toward the door that led to what she assumed was the rest of the house. "You don't have to do that," Sarah said. "This is your kitchen." He paused. He looked at her the way a person looks at a sentence they have to read twice before they are sure they understand it. "I've got work outside," he said, and then he went. Sarah set down her things and began. She cooked the boarding house meals over the next 3 hours, portioning everything into the covered vessels she had brought, then cleaned the kitchen with the same care she would have given her own, and was ready to leave by mid-morning. She was tying down the last of the covered pots on the cart when Cyrus came back from the fields. He was covered in the pale, dry dust of the soil, and he stopped when he saw her still there, seeming to have expected her to be gone. "Everything was as you left it," she said. "Better, I think, because I banked the fire properly. It was running too hot on the right side." He looked at her. "You noticed that? My grandmother had the same model stove. It's a common problem if the flue draft isn't balanced." She climbed onto the cart seat and gathered the reins. "I'll be back tomorrow morning if that's agreeable." There was a pause that lasted exactly long enough to make her wonder. "It's agreeable," he said. She drove back to town with the morning's meals and thought about how his voice had sounded when he said that. Not warm, exactly. Not cold, either. Like a door that was not fully open but was also no longer entirely shut. She came back Tuesday morning as she had said she would. And Wednesday. And Thursday. By Wednesday something had shifted in the Norris kitchen. Cyrus no longer disappeared immediately into the fields the moment she arrived. He lingered at the table with his coffee while she worked, not speaking at first, just present the way a man is present who has been alone long enough that even the companionable silence of another person becomes something worth having. Sarah did not push the silence into conversation. She had enough sense for that. Cooked, she moved around the kitchen with the quiet efficiency of someone who had been doing this since childhood, and she let the silence be what it was. On Wednesday morning, he said, "You don't need to straighten the shelves." She had been straightening the shelf beside the stove without really thinking about it, the way her hands sometimes moved ahead of her mind in a familiar environment. She stopped. "Sorry, habit." "I didn't say stop," he said. "I said you don't need to." She looked at him over her shoulder. He was looking at his coffee cup. She went back to straightening the shelves. On Thursday morning, he asked where she had learned to cook. "My mother," she said. And then necessity. "My mother died when I was 14 and my father wasn't able to manage the kitchen alongside everything else, so I took it over." She turned a pan on the stove. "You learn fast when people are depending on you too." There was a silence. Then, "How old are you?" 26. Another silence. "Where was the farm?" "Central Missouri, about 30 miles southeast of Jefferson City. Small operation, wheat mostly." She paused. "We had a bad drought year in '76. I know what it does to a place." She felt him go still behind her in a way that was different from his usual stillness. This was a stillness that meant something had been heard. "Then you know," he said, and his voice was quieter than it had been. "I know," she said. She did not turn around. She finished what she was doing on the stove and went about her work, and the kitchen felt different after that, not lighter exactly, but more honest, like a room where the windows had been opened after a long time shut. Friday was the last day she was supposed to be there. The blacksmith had returned from Wichita on Thursday, and Martha's stove was being repaired that afternoon, would be serviceable by Friday evening. Sarah arrived at the Norris farm Friday morning knowing it was the final time and not quite sure how she felt about that. She cooked the meals, cleaned up, set everything in order. Cyrus came in from outside at the same time he had been coming in all week, as if he had adjusted his morning schedule to include this particular pause. He poured coffee and sat at the table. He watched her work. "Stoves fixed?" he asked. "Supposedly by this evening." He nodded. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. Sarah packed her things into the carrying basket she had brought. She was nearly done when she turned and found him standing, which surprised her because she had not heard him move. "I want to pay you something," he said, "for the use of the stove. Martha already offered to pay you. Martha offered to pay for the use." "I mean to pay you for the trouble of coming out here every morning." Sarah looked at him. He was looking at her with those dark, careful eyes, and there was something in them she had been seeing all week, a quality she could only call hunger, and not for food but for exactly this, the ordinary presence of another person moving through the same space. "It wasn't trouble," she said honestly. He seemed unsure what to do with that. He put his hand in his pocket and then took it out again. "Come Sunday," he said. He said it to the floor and then corrected that and said it to her. "If you wanted to, there's nothing to repay. I just meant if you wanted to come back." Sarah held still for a moment. "Sunday is my day off," she said. "I have it free after the noon meal." "In the afternoon then," he said, "if you wanted." "What would we do?" she asked, not coyly, genuinely. He seemed to think about it. "I could show you the south field, the one that's actually producing. There's a half-acre that's somehow held on this season. I don't know why, it just did." She thought of that, a half-acre of something living, surviving in all that pale devastation. "I'd like to see that," she said. And there it was, the smallest thing, and yet it was something. A door opened a crack, light coming through. She went back to town and delivered the meals and said nothing to Martha about Sunday, though Martha watched her with the sharp eyes of a woman who had been paying close attention all week and had formed her own conclusions. Sunday came with a clear, cold sky, the kind of blue that only exists in the Kansas autumn, deep and hard as a stone. Sarah finished the noon meal service, changed out of her kitchen apron into her better jacket, and drove the 2 miles east with a covered dish balanced on the seat beside her. She had not planned the dish. It had simply happened the way some decisions happen. Her hands had started and her mind had caught up later. She had made a proper supper, the kind her mother used to make on cold autumn Sundays, a beef and root vegetable stew, slow cooked, with the last of the autumn parsnips from Martha's garden and dried herbs, and a dark, rich broth that smelled like the idea of warmth. She had made a half-dozen biscuits to go with it. She had wrapped everything carefully and brought it without fully asking herself why. She arrived at the farmhouse to find Cyrus on the porch, sitting on the steps with a mending project in his hands, a leather harness that needed stitching. He looked up when she came down the road and stood when she pulled the cart to a stop. She climbed down and lifted the covered dish. "I brought supper," she said. "I hope that's all right." He looked at the dish. He looked at her. Something moved across his face that was not quite an expression and not quite an emotion, but was something between them, like a word that hasn't yet been spoken. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know I didn't," she said simply. "I wanted to." He held the door open for her without another word, and she carried the dish into the kitchen and set it on the stove to stay warm. And when she turned around, he was standing in the doorway between the kitchen and the hall with his hat in his hands, and he was looking at her with an expression that she could only describe as undone. Not sad exactly, not broken, but the look of a man who has been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and has suddenly, without expecting it, been offered a place to set it down. She said, "You should show me the south field before the light goes." He put his hat on. They walked out together into the long, pale afternoon. The south field was exactly what he had described, a half-acre of late-season growth that had no particular reason for surviving but had done so anyway. The wheat was thin and the stalks were shorter than they should have been, but they were green and standing, and when the wind moved through them they made that sound, that low whispered rushing sound that Sarah had grown up with in Missouri and had not heard in 2 years. She stopped walking and just listened. Cyrus stopped beside her. He was watching her face. "It sounds like home," she said, not to him particularly, just to the air. "Yes," he said. They stood there for a while in the way two people stand when they are beginning to trust a shared silence. Then he said, "My father planted this field the year I was born. He said it was the best soil on the property. In a good year it would yield enough to matter." He paused. "Most of the yield from the last 3 years was dust. But not this half-acre. Not this half-acre." She turned and looked at him. The late afternoon light was on his face, and it was doing what that light always did in October, finding the architecture of a face and making it honest. She could see he was tired in a way sleep did not fix. She could see the 3 years of it in the lines around his eyes, in the set of his jaw. "How do you keep going?" she asked. The question came out quieter than she intended, more personal, but she let it stand because it was genuine. He was quiet for a while. "Then I don't know that it's a decision exactly. It's more like the morning comes and I get up because that's what the morning requires. And then the next thing requires the next thing." He looked back at the field. "My father built this place. My grandfather claimed the land. If I leave, all of it is just gone. And they are gone too." Sarah understood that. She understood it in the place where understanding lives before it becomes words. "My father almost lost our place in '76, she said. "I was 8 years old. I remember how he looked, how he walked around the property at night sometimes when he thought everyone was asleep, just walking the perimeter of it. Like he was trying to keep it from dissolving by keeping his eyes on it." She paused. "The rains came in '77. He cried in the field when the first good rain came. I was watching from the window. He didn't know." Cyrus turned to look at her. She kept her eyes on the field. "The rains will come back here too," she said. "You can't know that." "No," she agreed. "But they came back in Missouri. They come back somewhere." He did not answer that. But he did not look away from her, and she felt the weight of his attention like weather, like something real and large moving in. They walked back to the house as the sun came down to the tree line. The stew was warm and the biscuits were perfect, and Cyrus Norris ate 2 helpings of each without appearing to notice he was doing it, which told Sarah everything she needed to know about how he had been feeding himself. He ate with the focused attention of a man who has been eating to survive rather than to enjoy, and then midway through the second helping something seemed to ease in him. His shoulders dropped a fraction, his jaw unclenched, and he looked across the table at her with something new in his eyes. "This is very good," he said. "Thank you. I mean," he paused, seeming to want to say it right. "I don't remember the last time something tasted like effort had been put into it." "That's a sad thing to say," she said, but gently. "It's a true thing to say." She refilled his coffee cup without asking, and he watched her do it and said nothing, and it was the most natural thing in the world. After supper she washed the dishes because she was not going to leave them, and he dried them because he was not going to let her do it alone. And they worked side by side in the kitchen, with the lamp burning low and the night pressing at the windows, and it was comfortable in a way that surprised both of them into something like ease. She was nearly done when he said, out of nowhere, "Pete Calloway's mule got into his wife's kitchen garden last week and ate the entire second planting of turnips. Every last one." She turned to look at him, surprised by the abrupt change of subject. "The mule had the audacity to look pleased with himself," Cyrus continued, and his expression was doing something she had not seen it do before. The corners of his mouth were working, fighting something. And Pete was standing there holding a rake, and the mule just looked at him like he had done Pete a considerable favor by removing the turnips. Sarah felt the laugh before it arrived. What did Pete do? He stood there for about 30 seconds and then he sat down on the garden fence, and I think he was going to yell, but instead he just started telling the mule very calmly everything that was wrong with its character, in detail, for about 10 minutes. And Sarah laughed, a full, real laugh, surprised out of her by the image of it. And Cyrus Norris, who had not laughed since before the drought, who had not had a reason, who had not been in the same room as something light enough to carry him above the weight of the last 3 years. Cyrus Norris looked at her laughing, and he could not help it. The sound of it, the realness of it, the way she covered her mouth with her hand while her eyes went bright, he could not help it. He laughed. It came out rough and rusty, like a hinge that had not been used in a long time, but it was real. It moved through him like the first air that moves through a room when the windows are thrown open after winter. He laughed and she laughed, and in the small kitchen of the Norris farmhouse, with the lamp burning and the coffee warm and the supper done, something that had been frozen for 3 years began, very carefully, to thaw. He stopped before she did and sat looking at the table with an expression she could not entirely read. She stopped laughing too, because the quality of his stopping told her it mattered. "I had forgotten what that felt like," he said quietly. She did not say anything to that. She did not need to. She drove back to town that evening with the empty dish and the covered warmth of something beginning, and she sat with it without trying to name it, because some things deserve to be felt before they are defined. Cyrus stood on his porch and watched the cart go, until it disappeared around the road's bend in the dark, and then he went inside and sat at the table for a long while with the lamp burning and his hands flat on the wood, and he felt the strange and unfamiliar lightness of having laughed, and he did not fight it. The week that followed was an ordinary week in Caldwell in October 1882, which meant it was busy in the specific ways of a frontier town settling into the season. There was a shipment at Firth's General Store that required half the town to come in and collect winter supplies. There was a dispute between 2 ranchers over a shared fence line that occupied Sheriff Hale for 3 days and eventually resolved itself when one of the ranchers got tired of the argument and simply moved the fence. There was a minor excitement when a group of trail riders came through that turned out to be cowboys bringing a late herd north for a buyer in Abilene, and the men stayed one night, filled the saloon, and were gone by sunrise without incident. Sarah cooked. She managed the boarding house kitchen with the efficiency that had made her valuable to Martha from the first day, and she was good at the work in a way that gave her genuine satisfaction, not the dull satisfaction of completed obligation, but the real satisfaction of doing something well that mattered to other people. She thought about Cyrus Norris while she worked, in the specific intermittent way thoughts come when they have attached themselves to something. She thought about the way he had laughed, about how it had arrived reluctantly and then was entirely real, about how he had looked at her after. On Wednesday, returning from Firth's store with the weekly supply order, she passed the road east of town and stopped the cart for no practical reason and sat there for a moment looking down the 2 miles toward the Norris property. The sky was large and pale. The road was empty. She sat there long enough to make a decision and then turned the cart back toward the boarding house. On Thursday afternoon, between the midday meal and supper preparation, she sat down and wrote a letter. Not to Cyrus. It was not that kind of letter. It was to her friend Emma Paulson, who had been her closest friend in St. Louis and who wrote regularly to ask how the West was treating her. Sarah wrote about Caldwell, about Martha's boarding house, about the country and the quality of light in October and the particular way the wind worked here, different from Missouri, different from the city. And then she wrote one careful paragraph about a man she had met, describing what she knew about him, the farm, the drought, the years of it, and in writing that paragraph she realized that what she had been thinking about all week was less about whether she wanted something and more about whether he could afford to want it. A man carrying what Cyrus Norris was carrying might not have room. She folded the letter and set it aside to mail on Friday. On Friday, he came into town. She saw him through the boarding house window. She was at the sink peeling potatoes for the evening meal, and she had a clear line of sight to the main street, and she recognized the way he sat on his horse before she recognized anything else about him. He rode a gray gelding, moved through the street with that same careful deliberation, stopped outside Firth's store. She went back to peeling potatoes and then stopped again. She wiped her hands on her apron, told herself she was going to the store for baking soda, which she had been meaning to pick up anyway, and went. She was not surprised to find him at the counter, but the way he turned when she came through the door immediately, as if he had sensed rather than seen her, that surprised her a little. "Miss Crawford," he said. "Mr. Norris." She turned to Elias Firth. "Do you have baking soda?" "Third shelf," Firth said, gesturing, and then was immediately called away by something in the back room with the impeccable timing of a man who understood social situations. Sarah went to the third shelf. Cyrus was at the counter waiting for his order to be wrapped. "How is the farm?" she asked, because it was the natural thing. "Same," he said. Then, after a moment, "The half-acre looks good. Might yield something worth having." "That's good." She found the baking soda. A pause. Then he said, "I was going to ask Pete Calloway to come by this Sunday." She turned. He was looking at the counter. "I was going to ask him, and then I thought—" He stopped. He started again. "I thought I might ask you instead." She felt something warm and specific move through her chest. To come for supper, to come for the afternoon. He looked at her now, straight and careful. "I'll cook this time, or attempt to." She understood completely what it cost a man like him to offer that, not the cooking, but the invitation, the decision to want something enough to ask for it. "I'll come for the afternoon," she said. Firth returned from the back room at exactly that moment carrying a paper-wrapped bundle, and whatever had just happened between them in the third-shelf aisle of his store became simply two people conducting their ordinary business, which is perhaps what made it possible. Sunday afternoon. She arrived at the Norris farm to find smoke coming from the kitchen chimney and a horse standing in the yard she did not recognize, and for one moment her stomach dropped before she understood. Cyrus had borrowed a mare from somewhere to have available if she wanted to ride the property. He met her at the door. He was wearing a clean shirt. She noticed that the way you notice small, deliberate things. "I hope you ride," he said. "I haven't in 2 years, but yes." "There's not much to ride in a city," he said, and the faintest thing moved across his expression that was almost dry humor. "There truly isn't," she agreed. They rode the property in the long afternoon, and he showed her the land the way a man shows something he loves even when it has caused him enormous pain, with a pride that is also a kind of grief, pointing out where things had been and where he hoped they might be again. He showed her the well that had gone low but had not run dry. He showed her the north field where the soil was best and where, if the rains came next spring, he intended to plant. He showed her the barn where he still kept 2 horses and a small number of chickens, the only livestock he had been able to hold onto. She asked questions because she understood agriculture and because she was genuinely interested, and he answered them in the increasing detail of a man who had not had anyone to talk to about any of it in a long time. He had attempted a stew. It was not as good as hers, and he said so directly, and she said it was fine and was telling the truth because it was at least honest food, cooked with effort, and that counted for something. He had made coffee correctly, which was more than some men managed. After supper they sat on the porch in the cold evening air, wrapped in the wool blankets he brought out from the house, and she asked him about his father. He talked about Hector Norris for a long time. He talked about the man's hands, how large they were, how he could grip a fence post bare-handed while the other end was hammered in. He talked about his father's laugh, which had apparently been legendary in the county, a sound like a good log settling in a fire. He talked about the summer of 1871 when the wheat yield had been the finest they'd ever had, and his father had danced on the porch with his mother until they knocked over a chair and his mother had laughed until she cried. Your mother, Sarah said. She died when I was 12. The same fever that took Daniel took her first 20 years earlier. He said it plainly with the plainness of a very old grief. My father raised us after, and Daniel was younger, 4 years younger. He was 27. A pause. He caught the fever in late September of last year. I thought he would come through it. He always came through things. He stopped. The night was very quiet. He didn't come through this one. Sarah did not say anything that a person usually says in these moments because the usual things were not enough. She said, "It sounds like you loved him very well." Cyrus looked at her. "I did," he said simply. She looked up at the stars, which were extraordinary out here without city light to diminish them. "My mother died on a Wednesday in March," she said. "I remember because it was the day the red-winged blackbirds come back to Missouri every year without fail. And they came back that morning and she died that afternoon. And for years after that I couldn't see a red-winged blackbird without the whole day coming back." She paused. "And then something shifted about 2 years after, and instead of the grief it was just her. I would see the birds and think of her, not the dying, just her." Cyrus was quiet for a long moment. "Did you choose that shift?" "No, it just came." "I hope that happens," he said softly. And the way he said it with such simple and undefended hope cut straight to the center of her. She left that evening later than she had the previous Sunday. And when she drove away, she was warm in spite of the cold, warmed from the inside by something that she finally allowed herself to name as she drove. She was falling in love with Cyrus Norris. She drove the 2 miles back to town in the dark, and the cold with that knowledge sitting in her chest like a coal, steady and real. And she did not argue with it because there was no point arguing with something that true. What she did not know, sitting there in the dark, was that he stood on his porch and watched her go the same way he had the week before, and that when the cart disappeared, he stood there a full minute longer before he went in, and that he sat at the kitchen table and understood, in the honest and undefended way of a man who has nothing left to lie to himself about, that he had been waiting all week for today and would be waiting all next week for the next Sunday. He understood that he was in more trouble than the drought had ever given him, and that unlike the drought, he did not want it to end. November came in hard. The first real cold, the kind that settles into the bones of old buildings and makes the mornings difficult, and the wind turned mean and constant. Caldwell battened down. The boarding house boarders wore their coats at the dinner table for the first week, until Sarah convinced Martha to let her adjust the damper on the repaired stove, after which the kitchen at least was genuinely warm. Cyrus harvested the half-acre. He did it alone, which took the better part of 3 days, and the yield was modest but real enough to keep him in flour and cornmeal through the winter and leave a small surplus to sell. He brought a portion of the surplus to Firth's store on a Friday in the second week of November, and when Sarah happened to be there collecting the week's order, he told her about it with a quieter kind of pride than she had seen in him before, not the pride of great success, but the pride of a small thing managed against difficulty, which she understood was more meaningful. Their Sundays had become established, not by formal arrangement but by the specific gravity of 2 people whose orbits had adjusted to include each other. She came in the afternoon. They rode or walked or sat on the porch if the weather allowed, and they talked in the way they had developed honestly, with space for silence, without the performance that courtship in town required. Because it was courtship. By November it was clearly that. Martha had stopped pretending not to notice and had asked Sarah one evening, woman to woman, over the dishes, whether there was something she wanted to say about how her Sundays were being spent. Sarah had said yes, that she was spending them at the Norris farm. Martha had absorbed this with the expression of someone who is not surprised. She had then said, "Cyrus Norris is a good man carrying a heavy load. Make sure you know what you're walking into." "I do know," Sarah said. "Do you, though?" Martha set a dry dish on the shelf. "He was a different man before the drought. All of this," she gestured broadly, meaning the grief and the land and the years of it, has compressed him. People who have been compressed that way can go either direction when they're finally released. They can open up or they can break. Sarah thought about that. I think he's the kind that opens up, she said. Martha looked at her. So do I, she said quietly. I just wanted to make sure you'd thought about it. The Saturday in the third week of November, Cyrus came into town not just for supplies but for something else. He stood outside Firth's general store for a full 5 minutes before going in, which Firth would later mention to his wife with considerable amusement. He went directly to the small display case where Firth kept a modest selection of good items, not jewelry exactly, as this was a general store, but small, useful, beautiful things that a man might buy for a particular purpose. He stood at the case for several minutes. He left with a small tortoiseshell hair comb with a delicate carved edge. It was not expensive. It was the most considered purchase he had made in 3 years. He drove back to the farm and put the comb on the kitchen table and then picked it up and put it in his coat pocket and took it out twice more before Sunday came. When Sarah arrived that Sunday afternoon, she found him on the porch again, but without the harness mending or any other project. Just sitting, which was unlike him, and which told her immediately that something was different about this particular Sunday. They walked out to the south field, the half-harvested half-acre now turned and resting. The sky was close and gray, the smell of snow in it. The wind was low. He said, I want to say something and I'm going to say it badly. She turned to face him. He was standing with his hat in his hands and the winter sky behind him. I have been a poor bet for company for 3 years, he said. I know that. I am not a man with a great deal to offer right now in the way of ease, or lightness, or certainty. He looked at the hat in his hands. I have a farm that is barely holding and a bank note that's current but not comfortable and no family left except a cousin in Nebraska I haven't seen in 4 years. He looked up. What I have is this land and whatever I am, which I know is not currently very much. You're more than you think you are, she said. He looked at her with those deep, careful eyes. You have made this past month the first month in 3 years where I felt like a person rather than just the last thing standing between this land and the bank. His voice was steady but barely. I don't know what you would call what I feel for you. I know it's not small. She was very still, the way she had been still in the south field that first Sunday, listening. I would like to continue what we've been doing, he said. And I would like it to be clear between us what it is. What is it? She asked, not to make him work for it, but because she needed to hear him say it. I think you know, he said. And then because he was a man who honored his obligations, even the difficult ones. It is that I am in love with you, Sarah Crawford, and I would very much like to know if there is a chance that means anything to you. The wind came through the empty field and moved her hair. Cyrus Norris, she said, and her voice was warm and entirely steady. You are the most deliberately careful man I have ever met in my life, and I have been in love with you since the second Sunday in October, and I have been waiting with considerable patience for you to arrive at this particular conversation. He stared at her. Something happened in his face, that same movement she had seen when she brought the supper without being asked, that look of a man offered a place to set something down, only larger now. He reached into his coat pocket and took out the tortoiseshell comb. He held it out to her in his big, work-roughened hand. This is a poor sort of it is beautiful, she said, taking it from him. She turned it in her fingers. You picked this out yourself? Yes. She looked up at him, and he was watching her with everything he felt written plainly on his face now, all the careful keeping finally given up. She reached out and put her hand on his chest, just over his heart, and felt him breathe. He put his hand over hers. They stood in the empty field in the cold November afternoon with the smell of snow coming and the sky pressing low, and he said her name, just that, just her name, and the way he said it was a whole sentence. She rose onto her toes and kissed him, and he received it the way you receive something you have been afraid to want, with his whole self completely. The snow came that evening, the first real snow of the season, and she drove back to town through the early flakes with the tortoiseshell comb in her pocket and her chest full of a warmth that weather could not touch. December in Caldwell was a month of compressed community. The cold brought people together in the way cold always does on the frontier, making the common spaces, the church, the general store, the boarding house parlor more essential and more frequented. There were town gatherings that Martha attended and that Sarah occasionally accompanied her to, and Cyrus came in from the farm more often than he had in previous winters, which did not go unnoticed. They were quiet about it but not secret. There was a difference. Sarah did not announce anything and neither did he. But when they were in the same room together, the fact of them was apparent to anyone paying attention. And in a town the size of Caldwell, everyone was paying attention. Elias Firth mentioned to his wife that Cyrus Norris had started smiling when he came in the store, which the wife found noteworthy enough to pass on at the next church social. Ruth Hennessy observed Sarah wearing the tortoiseshell comb on a Sunday morning and commented on how lovely it was. And when Sarah said where it had come from, Ruth's expression achieved an entire emotional range in the span of 2 seconds. Pete Calloway said to Cyrus one afternoon in the feed store without preamble, "I hear you've been keeping company with Martha Greer's girl." Cyrus said, "That's an accurate report." Pete said, "Good," and then picked up his feed sack and left, which was about as elaborate as the old man got on the subject of human feeling. They had supper together on the Sundays when weather allowed, and sometimes she came midweek when the boarding house schedule permitted. He had by early December become a better cook through the simple process of having something to improve himself for, and she thought this was one of the better developments in the history of the Norris farm kitchen. They talked about everything. About the land and its history, about her years in Missouri and his childhood here, about what the frontier was becoming. The cattle drives were already changing as more homesteaders settled the grazing land, and both of them could see that the wide-open world of the last 20 years was being replaced by something more bounded, more settled, not better or worse necessarily, but different. They talked about the railroad coming through more of the region and what it might mean for a small farm operation, about the prices for wheat when the drought finally broke. They talked one evening about the broader changes in the territory, and it was Cyrus who brought up something he clearly felt strongly about. "I rode past the Cheyenne camp south of Pratt last spring," he said, turning his coffee cup. "On the way back from selling the last of the cattle. There were families there living on ground that wouldn't have been given to anyone else, and nobody in Caldwell seems to think twice about how they ended up there." He paused. "My father used to talk about what this land looked like before we got here. He wasn't sentimental about it, but he was honest." "It is a hard thing to hold both," Sarah said. "You have built here and what it cost people who were here before." "It is. I don't have a clean resolution for it, but I don't think looking away from it is right either." She thought of the things she had seen in St. Louis, the indifference to suffering that cities allowed because the scale made it easy to unsee. "My father used to say that the first dishonesty is the one you tell yourself." Cyrus looked at her. "Your father sounds like he was worth knowing." "He is. He's still in Missouri, still farming." She paused. "I should write to him about you." The words came out naturally, and she watched him process them, watched the careful man absorb the implication of them with the quietest expression of pleasure she had seen on him. "I think you should," he said. She wrote the letter that week. She told her father about Caldwell, about the boarding house, about the drought that had scarred the land east of town. She told him about a man named Cyrus Norris who had a half-acre of wheat that had survived against all logic and whose laugh had come back like the first sound after a long silence. She told her father that she thought she had found somewhere worth being. Her father wrote back before Christmas. His letter was 2 pages in the large, unsteady hand he had developed as his vision aged, and it asked after the man's family name and the state of his property and whether he was a church-going man. And then at the bottom of the 2nd page it said, "If he is good to you and you are glad, then I am glad." She brought the letter to Cyrus on a Sunday in mid-December and read him that last line, and he sat with it for a moment and then said very quietly, I intend to be. Christmas in 1882 was a cold and clear thing in Caldwell, the sky so sharp it seemed like it might ring if struck. Martha decorated the boarding house with pine boughs she had the boarders collect from the north draw, and the kitchen produced the best Christmas dinner any of the boarders had tasted in their traveling lives, or said so anyway, which was the right thing to say. Cyrus came to town for Christmas, which he had not done in 2 years. He sat at the church service in the morning and walked back afterward with Sarah in the cold, bright air, and they stopped at the edge of the main street and stood looking at the town, small and impermanent looking, the buildings dwarfed by the sky, and yet lit from within by people who had chosen to be here and were making a life from the choice. "I want to ask you something," he said. She turned to look at him. The cold had put color in his face and his eyes were clear, and there was something in them she had not seen before, a kind of bright certainty, like a man who has made a decision and found it solid beneath him. "I want to ask you to marry me," he said. "I know the farm is not what it should be. I know what I'm asking you to walk into. I won't pretend the hard parts aren't there." He took a breath. "But I love you, Sarah, and I believe we could build something together that is better than what either of us could build alone. And I believe very strongly that the hard years are behind us. That what's coming is better." She looked at his face in the Christmas morning light. She thought of everything she knew of him, the still hands, the careful eyes, the long drought of his grief, and the first cracked sound of his returning laugh. She thought of the half-acre of wheat that had survived without reason, and the way he had stood in it and let her hear how much it meant. "Yes," she said. "Cyrus Norris, yes." He exhaled like a man who has been holding his breath for longer than he realized. He took her hands in his, those large, work-roughened hands, and held them carefully, the way you hold something valuable. Then he smiled at her. A full, real smile, the kind she suspected his neighbor Pete had not seen on him in 3 years. It changed his whole face. It was worth everything it had cost to get to it. She reached up and put her hand on his jaw and said, "There you are." He covered her hand with his. They married in February of 1883 in the Caldwell church, with the white paint still peeling and the congregation filling every pew, and Pete Calloway in the front row looking as if he would burst with satisfaction. Martha Greer cried throughout the entire service and maintained afterward that she had something in her eye. Ruth Hennessy made Sarah's dress, an ivory wool with small pearl buttons, simple and beautiful and right. Sarah wore the tortoiseshell comb in her hair. Cyrus stood at the front of the church and watched her come down the aisle toward him with the expression of a man who has been given back something he thought he had lost for good, and is making sure he sees every detail of it. The pastor asked the questions and they gave the answers, and the congregation witnessed, and the winter morning outside was absolutely still and clear. When it was done and they walked back down the aisle together, Cyrus said close to her ear, "You are stuck with me now, Sarah Norris." She turned and looked at him with bright eyes. "I was counting on that," she said. They went back to the farm that afternoon, now her farm as well, her home, a word that settled on her like the best kind of weight. She had moved her things over the week before, learning the house from the inside, discovering which windows let in the morning light and which floorboard creaked in the hall, and where the best place to read was in the afternoon, which turned out to be the chair by the east kitchen window, where the winter sun came in long and pale and warm against the cold outside. The farmhouse that had been silent with one person became something else with two. Not loud, neither of them were loud people, but inhabited in a different way, full in a different way. Spring came with the reluctance of a spring that doesn't quite believe it is time yet, cold through March and barely warming into April. But the rains came in April, not the devastating downpour of a desperate sky finally giving up, but the steady, purposeful rain of a season turning properly, the kind of rain that soaks in rather than running off. Cyrus stood on the porch the first morning it rained, and Sarah came and stood beside him, and they looked at it together. The brown earth beginning to darken with moisture, the sky doing its proper work for the first time in years. He put his arm around her and she leaned against his side, and neither of them said anything because there was nothing to say that the rain wasn't already saying better. He planted in May. She helped because she knew how, because it was her land now too, because she would not stand inside while her husband worked the field alone. They planted the north field, the best soil on the property, full width for the first time in years. They planted together in the long spring days, and in the evenings they ate at the kitchen table and talked about what was growing and what might grow and what they were building here. And the kitchen was full of light and the smell of something living. That summer was the summer of the return. That was how she thought of it afterward, the summer the land came back, and with it a kind of abundance that had been so long absent that its arrival felt almost unreal. The wheat grew. It grew with the single-minded purpose of something that has been waiting for its moment, straight and thick and tall. And by late July the north field was a sea of gold that moved in the summer wind with that rushing sound that Sarah loved, and that Cyrus would stand at the field's edge to listen to for minutes at a time. He harvested in August with help. Pete Calloway came over, and 2 other neighboring farmers whose own fields had also revived, and they brought their equipment and their backs and worked the Norris North field over 3 days in the August heat. Sarah fed them all, enormous meals at the big table she and Cyrus had added to the kitchen in June because the old one was too small, and the men ate until they were quiet, and she sent them back to the field with coffee and cornbread, and the knowledge that there was more where that came from. The yield was the best the Norris North field had produced since 1878. When Cyrus sat with the ledger that evening and added the numbers, the banknote became comfortable for the first time in years. The debt that had sat on his shoulders like a stone began to lift. He sat at the kitchen table looking at the numbers for a long time. Then he put down the pencil and folded his hands and said, "We are going to be all right." Sarah, who was at the stove making the evening coffee, turned to look at him. His face in the lamplight was something she would remember for the rest of her life. The relief on it, enormous and private, the release of something he had been holding against all hope for years. She crossed the kitchen and put her arms around him from behind, her cheek against his hair, and felt him breathe. "I know," she said. "I've known since April." He turned and looked up at her. "You're very certain for a Missouri girl." "Missouri girls learn certainty early," she said. "We have to. The weather up there is very unreliable." He laughed. He laughed properly, that laugh that had been returning to him steadily since the October Sunday when the first rusty version of it had surprised them both in the kitchen. It was fully restored now, his laugh warm and real, and settling into the room the way his father's must have settled, like a good log in a fire. She kissed the top of his head and went back to the coffee. In September, when the harvest was in and the ledger was balanced, and the land was at rest in the way of a field after a good season, Sarah told Cyrus she was expecting. She told him in the kitchen in the morning, very simply, because she was not a woman who dramatized the simple things. He went very still the way he had gone still when she had first mentioned the drought back in October of the previous year. That specific quality of stillness that meant he had been reached in a deep place. Then he stood up from the table and crossed the kitchen in 2 steps and put his arms around her with a gentleness that a man of his size and work-hardened hands achieved by pure intention, and he held on for a long time without saying anything. "Cyrus," she said finally, her voice muffled against his shoulder. "Give me a moment," he said, his voice entirely unsteady. She gave him the moment. He started. He stopped. "I don't have a word for this." "I think the word is happy," she offered. He pulled back and looked at her face. His own face was doing things she had not seen it do before, moving through expressions with none of the usual careful control, just open and real and full of something so large it didn't quite fit his features. "Yes," he said, "that is the word." He sat back down at the table, and she poured the coffee, and they sat together in the morning kitchen, with the September light coming in the east window. And they talked about it the way they talked about everything, honestly, with full attention, with the pleasure of having someone to share the large things with. The winter of 1883 into 1884 passed with a different quality than any winter Cyrus had known in recent years. The farmhouse, which had been a place of solitary maintenance, was now alive in ways he had forgotten a home could be. Sarah rearranged the front room, and it became genuinely livable. She put curtains in the east window that were the same pale blue as her faded dress from the day she'd arrived in Caldwell, which she told him with considerable humor she was keeping as a reminder of how she'd started here. He improved things he had left unimproved because there had been no point, repaired the porch boards properly, fixed the barn door that had been sticking since the previous autumn, built new shelves in the kitchen that were level and solid, and that she filled with her dry goods and her preserves from the summer garden. They were visited regularly by the people of Caldwell, who had taken a proprietary interest in the state of the Norris farm and its new occupants. Pete Calloway came by every week or so and sat on the porch with Cyrus talking about the land, about the weather, about the region's future. Martha Greer came one Sunday with an extraordinary quantity of food and the thin pretense that she just happened to have extra, and she and Sarah sat in the kitchen for 3 hours talking in the close, honest way of women who have moved past social niceties and arrived at the good part. Ruth Hennessy came in January to begin work on what Sarah needed for the coming spring, because she had seen enough of pregnancy to know that planning ahead was wisdom, not vanity. The baby came in April, just as the spring rains were starting again, as if the land and the life of the Norris farm had agreed to synchronize their renewals. It was a boy. Cyrus held him in the kitchen where Sarah had been tended by Martha and the doctor from Caldwell, and he stood at the window with the baby in his arms and looked out at the rain coming down on the north field where the new season's planting was already in the ground. And Sarah watched him from the bed where she was resting and saw on his face everything she had ever hoped to put there. "What will we call him?" she asked. Cyrus turned from the window. His face was entirely open, entirely undone, entirely full. "Hector," he said, "if you're willing." She was willing, she was more than willing. She understood without needing it explained exactly what that name meant and why it mattered, the chain of it from the grandfather who claimed the land to the father who built on it to the son who held it through the worst years to this new morning and this small new life. "Hector Daniel Norris," she said, giving it the second name too. He looked at her with eyes that were bright and wet and entirely unashamed of it. "Yes," he said. Little Hector Daniel Norris arrived into a world that was, on the Norris farm at least, finally and genuinely good. The spring of 1884 was a fine one. The wheat went in under good conditions and the early rains were steady and the soil held them. By summer it was clear that the drought had fully broken, not just for the Norris farm but for the whole region around Caldwell, and there was a quality to the town that summer that was looser and more generous than it had been, people smiling more readily, the conversations in Firth's store carrying a lighter undertone. Cyrus hired a hand for the summer work, a quiet young man named Thomas who had come down from Nebraska looking for steady work, and who proved himself reliable and skilled enough that Cyrus kept him on into the autumn. Sarah watched her husband manage another person on the property with interest. Cyrus was a fair employer, direct and respectful, and Thomas ate at the house table with them at midday and went back to his bunk in the barn in the evening, and the arrangement worked. The farm grew, not dramatically, not in the way of ambition overreaching itself, but steadily, in the way of a thing that has been properly tended. They added 6 cows to the property in the summer, a decision made carefully with the numbers worked out twice. The milk was good and supplemented the household income through the winter in a way that provided genuine comfort. Hector grew the way babies do in the first year, astonishingly fast, as if hurrying to make up for the time before they existed. He was a solid child with his father's dark eyes and his mother's expression of calm assessment, and he regarded the world from his mother's hip or his father's arms with the focused interest of someone who has arrived somewhere and intends to understand it thoroughly. Cyrus with his son was the same man Sarah had always known, and also entirely new, more careful and more present at the same time, more likely to stop in the middle of any task to attend to the child, more likely to be found on the porch in the evening with the baby in the crook of his arm, and a look on his face that Sarah had no single word for, and did not need one. She found them like that on an October evening in 1884, exactly 1 year after the anniversary of her arrival in Caldwell. She had been in the kitchen and came out to find Cyrus on the porch steps with Hector asleep against his chest, the baby's face pressed into his father's shoulder, and the two of them wrapped in the same blanket against the October chill. The sky was doing the same thing it had done the October before and the October before that, that extraordinary autumn sunset that turned the Kansas sky all amber and rose above the flat horizon, the light coming long and soft across the wheat fields, the whole world golden. Cyrus looked up when she came through the door, and his face in that light was exactly the face she had first seen outside Firth's store, the same jaw and the same dark eyes and the same careful attention, and also entirely different, not compressed anymore, not holding anything down, open and present and suffused with a quiet happiness that had taken years of difficulty to earn and would not be taken cheaply. "He's been asleep for an hour," he said softly. "He had a busy afternoon," she said, sitting down beside him on the step. He put his arm around her, and she leaned into his side the way she had leaned in April watching the first rain of the restored season, and they sat together in the evening with the sleeping baby between them and the land before them and the sky going from gold to rose to the first deep blue of evening. The stars were appearing one by one. First one, then 3, then a dozen. "Do you remember," she said quietly, "what you told me the first week I came to use your kitchen? That you didn't know it was a decision exactly getting up every morning, that it was just what the morning required." He was quiet for a moment, thinking back. "I remember. Does it feel like a decision now?" He looked out at the field, at the first star growing bright above the tree line, at the land his grandfather claimed and his father built and that he had held through the worst years anyone had asked it to give. Then he looked at her. "Every morning," he said, "every single morning." She turned and kissed him, and he kissed her back with the arm that was not holding their sleeping son. And behind them the farmhouse held the lamplight in its windows, and before them the land that had come back from the edge of ruin breathed quietly in the October dark. The following spring, Sarah Crawford, Sarah Norris, though she had never entirely stopped thinking of herself by both names, a woman of 2 places and 1 home, wrote to her father in Missouri. The letter told him that the farm was well, that the north field had been expanded, that Hector Daniel was walking now, 15 months old and deeply convinced of his own opinions about everything, which she attributed to both sides of the family simultaneously. That Cyrus had finally repaired the fence along the south property line that had been a running negotiation with itself for 3 years. That the rains were coming regularly, and the wheat looked strong. And at the end of the letter she wrote, "I want you to know that I am happy in the full and actual sense of the word. Not the word used when you mean simply not unhappy, but genuinely, thoroughly happy in the way that only comes from having found the right place and the right person at the same time. I am glad I came west. I am glad every morning." Her father wrote back in July. He was, he said, coming to visit. He arrived in August, a gray-haired man with her eyes and her precise, assessing quality, and he looked at the Norris farm, at the wheat grown tall in the north field, at the solid farmhouse with its new porch boards and its kitchen garden full and green, at the cattle in the south pasture and the young hired hand efficient in the barn. And then he looked at Cyrus, who was standing on the porch waiting to meet him, and he looked at his daughter beside Cyrus with the baby on her hip. And the old farmer put his hands in his pockets and looked at all of it for a long moment. Then he said, "Well, this is very fine." Cyrus reached forward and shook his hand and said, "It's getting there, sir." The old man looked at him. "Young man," he said, "I grew up on a farm in Missouri and I know the difference between getting there and being there. This is being there." He looked at Sarah. "Your mother would have been very pleased." Sarah's throat tightened. "I know," she said. "Her father stayed 2 weeks. He walked the property with Cyrus every morning, and they talked about soil and weather and crops, and the particular stubbornness that farming required of a man. And Sarah watched them from the kitchen window sometimes, and felt the texture of her happiness deepen into something almost too much to hold. On the last morning of her father's visit, he found Sarah in the kitchen before anyone else was up, as he always had done, early morning being his best time. He sat at the table and she made coffee and they sat together in the first light while the house was still quiet. He said, "I worried about you in that city. I know you did. I worried after your mother died that you had taken on too much too young and that you would forget to make a life for yourself because you were too busy managing everyone else's." She looked at her father's old hands around the coffee cup. "I didn't forget," she said. "No," he smiled, a small, private smile. "No, you certainly did not." He went back to Missouri the next morning, and Sarah stood on the porch and watched the cart carry him back toward the Caldwell road and felt the particular love of someone watching a person they love go away from something good. Cyrus came and stood beside her. "Good man," he said. "Yes," she agreed. He approved, Cyrus said, and she could hear in his voice that this had mattered to him in a way he had not entirely told her. "He did," she said. She took his hand. "He told me last night that you reminded him of my grandfather, which from him is the highest thing he can say." Cyrus looked at the road where the cart had gone. "What was your grandfather like?" "Stubborn," she said. "Patient. Completely devoted to the people he loved. Couldn't tell a joke to save his life but laughed at everyone else's." Cyrus turned and looked at her with that smile that had come back to him and was fully his now, warm and unguarded. "That last part doesn't sound like me at all." "You laugh at mine," she pointed out. "Yours are funny." "They really are," she agreed, entirely without modesty. He laughed and put his arm around her, and they stood on the porch in the morning sun, while the September light came long across the north field. And behind them in the house Hector, Daniel Norris, was just beginning to make the sounds of a child who has slept long enough and requires the morning to begin. Cyrus went in to get the boy, and Sarah stayed on the porch one more moment, alone in the early sun, looking out at the land, at the field that was harvested and resting, pale gold in the morning, at the fence line her husband had repaired, at the garden plot she had expanded in the spring, and that had given them more than they needed this summer, enough to share with neighbors and still have put up for winter. At the sky, which was the deep clear blue of a Kansas morning at its best, enormous and honest, holding everything beneath it without preference or prejudice. She thought of October 1882, when she had stepped off a stagecoach in a small frontier town with a carpetbag and a list of things she could and could not count on. She thought of the boarding house kitchen and the cracked stove. She thought of a man standing outside a general store with his eyes down and his hands still, and 3 years of drought in his face. She thought of a half-acre of wheat that had survived without explanation. She thought of a kitchen in October and supper brought without being asked, and the first cracked sound of a man laughing who had forgotten how. She thought of everything after, the south field in November light, the cold porch and the blankets and the stars. Christmas morning and a tortoiseshell comb and a question asked plainly and answered the same way. The February wedding and the April rains and a baby named for 2 men who had worked this ground before him. The long summer evenings and the short winter mornings, and all the ordinary days in between that were the actual substance of a life. She put her hand on the porch post, the solid wood of the house her husband's family had built, warm already from the morning sun. "Coming," she called into the house, because Hector had progressed from sounds to words, and the word she could now hear was her name, called with the absolute certainty of a 14-month-old who knows exactly who he wants and will not accept substitutes. She went inside. Cyrus was at the kitchen table with the boy on his knee, bouncing him in that particular rhythm that Hector found hilarious. And the child was laughing big, uncomplicated infant laughter, the best sound in the world, and Cyrus was laughing too, looking at his son's face with his whole heart in his eyes. Sarah poured 3 cups of coffee, 2 to drink and 1 very small one with mostly milk that Hector had decided he required, and that they had resigned themselves to providing, because the alternative was a negotiation not worth having. She set them on the table and sat down and looked at the two of them, and felt the full and actual weight of what it was to be exactly where you were meant to be, doing exactly what you were meant to be doing, with exactly the people who were meant to be yours. Outside the window, the Kansas morning was coming into its full bright day. The wheat field rested. The sky was clear all the way to the horizon. Somewhere in the barn, Thomas had started the morning work, and the sound of it, ordinary, purposeful, the sound of a farm in proper order, came through the walls of the house and joined everything else, all the sounds of the life they had made here. Cyrus looked up from his son and met Sarah's eyes across the table. He did not need to say anything. Everything had already been said, but he said it anyway. "Good morning." She smiled at him, that full, clear smile he had first found in an October kitchen and had been trying to deserve ever since. "Good morning," she said. And the day opened up before them, wide and generous in theirs, the way all the days after this would be, not without difficulty, because nothing was without difficulty, but held against that difficulty by everything they had built here. The land, the home, the child, the love, and the memory of a half-acre of wheat that had survived against all reason, a small and stubborn green in all that pale and waiting dust, holding on until the rain came back.